Hello and welcome to There's No Business Like, a podcast where friends and industry colleagues explore topics and interview leaders in our industry of professional theatrical touring.
Hello and welcome back to There's No Business Like. I'm Katie Miller with Michigan Maven Creative Associates, and I am here with my friends, Brian.
Hello, Brian Zelmer from Bardavon Presents in Poughkeepsie, New York.
And Danielle.
Hi, it's Danielle Van Hook from the Alden in McLean, Virginia.
And Kevin.
Kevin Maynard coming at you from Tallahassee with opening nights at Florida State University.
All right, friends. So my question for you as we kick off today's episode is, have you ever been to any of these places? I'm going to name a place and you say yes or no. Boston.
Yes.
Berlin, Germany.
No.
San Francisco, California.
Yes.
No.
Washington, D.C.
Yes.
I was going to say Danielle. Yes, me too. Honolulu, Hawaii.
No.
No, you said the first part. Hawaii's a big place.
You've not been to Honolulu, but you've been to Hawaii, Danielle?
The airport.
Oh, okay. I see. I don't count that. You got to touch like.
I know. I don't
grounds.
either.
Yeah. Okay. Chicago, Illinois.
Yep.
Yes.
Airport. Me too. You've never been outside the airport?
No.
We're gonna have to change that someday. Mobile, Alabama.
Nope.
Yes.
Oh, interesting, Kevin. Okay. Well, these are just a few of the places that today's guest, Scott Speck, has traveled in his work as a classical orchestra conductor. Scott is the conductor of the Joffrey Ballet and Chicago Philharmonic, amongst other ensembles around the country. I want to talk to Scott and get his story and perspective in light of the fact that many of us work or collaborate with local or professional orchestras and other classical ensembles in our work, whether they rent our buildings, they're resident companies in our spaces, or, we're working with them as partners for community engagement or programming opportunities. I think you will find our conversation to be quite delightful. So listen and enjoy.
Hi, my name is Scott Speck. I'm a professional orchestra conductor, and I'm the music director and principal conductor of the West Michigan Symphony, the spectacular professional orchestra that makes its home in the Frauenthal Theater in downtown Muskegon, which I firmly believe is the best acoustics to be found between Chicago and Detroit. When I'm not conducting the West Michigan Symphony, I actually have 3 other positions as a conductor. I have a similar position with the Mobile Symphony in Alabama that does about the same number of concerts, about 1 weekend per month as the West Michigan Symphony. I'm also the music director of the Joffrey Ballet. Whenever they need an orchestra, I'm their conductor. And also in Chicago, I work with the Chicago Philharmonic Orchestra. So Chicago is actually where I have a strong foothold and an apartment. But I also have an apartment in Muskegon, Michigan, so that when I come to work with the West Michigan Symphony, I'm just 2 blocks away, and I feel like I am very much at home.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful introduction. Welcome, Scott, to There's No Business Like. It is such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Katie. Great to be with you. And I'm looking forward to answering questions that might be different than the kind of questions a conductor normally gets.
You have been with the West Michigan Symphony almost 20 years. And I was saying that I grew up watching you conduct my hometown symphony orchestra. And I would say, quite honestly, I'm very lucky and very blessed that my parents took my brother and I to see the symphony on a regular basis when we were growing up. And actually watching you conduct that orchestra, I think is very much started to inform anyway my approach to the arts and my approach to accessibility in the arts. So that's one of the things I want to talk about with you today. But we just have some shared history and a shared love of Muskegon and of this orchestra that brings so much to that community.
And I have to say, I feel absolutely honored to have been a part of your musical upbringing. How cool is that? It turns out it's actually probably more than 20 years. Back in the early 2000s is when they had their search for a new music director. And it was around 2002 that I was chosen. However, they had originally had 16 finalists for the position. Each one was given a whole concert week, and that took up 2 entire seasons. But I was hired at the end of the first of those seasons. So after I was already named music director, there were still 8 more conductors who were yet to come. They turned them into guest conductors rather than candidates. But that means that in my first year as music director of the West Michigan Symphony, I had 0 concerts.
Is that a typical process for finding a new music director?
Well, usually there are finalists, and each finalist is given a program and a week to work with the orchestra, but there usually aren't that many. It's usually more like 4.
Yeah, that seems like a lot. Apparently, the board and the symphony orchestra were very serious about finding the right candidate, which I think they did, clearly, by your longevity with the organization.
Well, it's been a wonderful match. I mean, I really have felt since the beginning that I'm in the right place, and I just love this group of people. I love this community, and it's amazing what we were able to achieve artistically at the West Michigan Symphony.
All right, well, we are going to dig into that in just a moment. But first, I would love to just hear a little bit about your career in general. So you gave us some of the places that you're conducting currently and or ensembles you're working with currently, but you have traveled the world conducting and music directing for ensembles, basically the laundry list of where I want to travel someday. So can you just tell us a little bit about how you got your start in the arts and the other ensembles or other work you've done across the United States and across the world?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Boston or outside of Boston. My parents were not musicians, but they were very artsy, and they were very happy to have me listen to classical music as a kid. And I'm sure that's what spurred my love of music. I played the piano as a kid, and then I went to Yale for my undergraduate bachelor's degree, majored in music. After that, I was really lucky that I received a Fulbright scholarship to study music in Germany. And this was during the absolute heyday of what I still consider to be the best orchestra in the world, the Berlin Philharmonic, and their great conductor at the time, Herbert von Karajan. I had the chance to observe rehearsals and observe many performances of this orchestra. And in fact, I even joined their chorus. And so for 2 years, I was singing all the great oratorios and great works for chorus, soloists, and orchestra with this fine, fine orchestra, the Berlin Philharmonic, and just a procession of the world's greatest guest conductors. And it was sort of through that experience that I honed, first of all, my concept of how I would like an orchestra to sound, something that I'm still working on daily with the West Michigan Symphony and every other orchestra that I work with, but also many different ideas of how you can be a conductor, what it means to be a conductor, what kind of gestures are effective and which ones are not effective. I learned all that from this cavalcade of amazing conductors that came through Berlin at the time. Then I went back to Boston to sort of do some remedial work on a few skills that I thought needed some work. And at the same time, I started taking cello lessons so I would understand the strings. I was already a pianist. I played some percussion so I'd understand the rhythm that's necessary in a conductor's beat. And having sung in choruses, I understood the needs, the vocal needs and the breathing needs of wind and brass instruments. After that, I went to California, University of Southern California. I got my master's in conducting. And right after that, I started working at a sort of fame-type high school. In other words, it was called the Orange County High School of the Arts. It's now called the Orange County School of the Arts, I think. And I was there, one of their first music directors of that orchestra. I then got my first professional job. And this sounds to a lot of people like a dream job. I was associate conductor of the Honolulu Symphony, and I worked and lived in Honolulu for 2-3 years. Just a wonderful time. After that, I got a sort of a series of music directorships, starting with the Mobile Symphony and then West Michigan Symphony. I worked for 2-3 years with the San Francisco Ballet, one of the great ballet companies in the world, and then the Washington Ballet, and then made my way to the Joffrey Ballet in Chicago, which is where I am now. Joffrey Ballet led to my work with the Chicago Philharmonic and a really wonderful relationship with them. So that leads to the 4 positions, all of which I'll add are sort of part-time positions. The West Michigan Symphony, Mobile Symphony, Joffrey Ballet, and Chicago Philharmonic. Mm-hmm. And as such, I get to tour. The Chicago Philharmonic has toured to Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall. The Joffrey Ballet has toured most recently to Germany, to Baden-Baden, and also to many times to Los Angeles, to Minneapolis, all over the country. And it's a thrill to get to go with them and work with them in various different concert halls, the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., and so on. So that's the really kind of fun part of the job.
Yes, and I think an incredibly fascinating part of the job. So I want to talk a little bit about your job, right? What it is like to be a conductor and a music director first, and then I want to get into some of the business and some maybe philosophical conversation about the role of classical music in the arts industry today. So first of all, what does your title conductor and music director even mean? And then I would love to know, what does that mean in the context of when you sit still in a singular venue? And then what does that mean when you go on tour, like you just mentioned, to other venues, either in the US or overseas?
All right. Well, the first thing I want to do is just express how incredibly lucky I feel that I am to be able to make a living professionally in music and nothing else. I'm doing, all of my income comes from being a conductor in various places. That is really, I'm just extraordinarily lucky there. And it makes it sound like there's an abundance of positions available, which is absolutely the opposite of what is true. In fact, for any job that I might have applied for, there were 200 to 300 people who also applied for it. If you can imagine applying for any office job and having 200 to 300 competitors.
That's a scary proposition.
It really is. And I will also say, along with that, that I do not recommend this profession to anybody just because of the dearth of opportunities out there. But for whatever reason, I was very lucky. And because I know so many conductors who I would consider to be on an equally high level or even a higher level, just consummate musicians who are out of work. They're out of work. And the thing is that if you lose a job as a conductor, if your orchestra goes out of business, it's not like you can just turn around and go to another orchestra.
Right.
They already have a conductor, and every city only has one or two, professional ones anyway. And so it's very much like trying to win the lottery again. And having won the lottery already this number of times professionally, I do not take it for granted, and I'm extraordinarily grateful for these opportunities. But to answer your question, what does it mean to be a music director and conductor? All of these organizations presumably put on performances. And the idea is to create performances that will interest the community, that might educate them, that would entertain them, might even enlighten them, or create sort of transformational, transcendent moments that might be comparable to the things that people say they feel in church or something like that they feel like they're exposed to another world. And then the question is, okay, how do you do that? So generally, it starts through programming, and this is something where the music director can have a lot of input. What pieces of music do I feel that the orchestra needs to play, that the audience needs to hear, that I really want to conduct? And I once saw somebody's cello case. It was one of those hard stand-up cello cases that had a bumper sticker on it that said, "So much music, so little time." And I find that to be so true because the number of just undisputed masterpieces of classical music it's in the hundreds or thousands. But in any given year at the West Michigan Symphony, we only play 5 or 6 concerts, right? And so, how do you decide which of the hundreds and thousands of amazing pieces you're going to play this year? Now, there is a list of war horses, as we call them, pieces that come around again and again because they tend to draw in an audience and also because they're so good. Beethoven's Fifth is a perfect example, or Beethoven's Ninth, or Dvorak New World Symphony, which we just performed with the West Michigan Symphony. William Tell Overture, pieces like this that the audience really loves to hear. And, we generally have a rule of thumb that we're going to always wait at least 5 years before bringing them back again. Probably better to wait 10 years. So, but now that I've been with this orchestra for a long enough time, I see pieces that are coming back for their 3rd or 4th time even. Quite amazing. So programming is a big part of it, but I don't do that in a vacuum. I do it in collaboration with basically a committee of people, but especially including our wonderful President and CEO, Andy Belo, and our Vice President for Operations and Personnel, Gabe Slimko, and various other very respected members of our staff, Karen Wheeler-O'Neill, whose great expertise is in marketing, and then members of the community. So it's not in a vacuum. And I mention community because the concerts that I might program in West Michigan are not at all the same as the concerts I might program in Mobile, Alabama. That I found the communities to have completely different personalities, for example. I'd be glad to elaborate on that if you like.
Yes, please do.
Well, here's a comparison between Mobile and West Michigan audiences. I feel that in general, if I were to narrow and boil down what the West Michigan Symphony audience wants and most appreciates, it's a transcendent experience. Mm-hmm. And so the audience might applaud enthusiastically, but even more importantly, they'll come up to me afterwards and say, that concert changed my life. It's that kind of thing. In Mobile, Alabama, there is much more, there's a huge appreciation for transformative and transcendent pieces of music. But there is, on top of that, much more of an emphasis on is this a fun experience? Mobile is where Mardi Gras got started in America. There's no doubting that among many things, it's a party town. And I wouldn't necessarily say that Muskegon is a party town. Like, that's not the first thing I would say about it.
I would agree with that.
So here you have two completely different communities, both of which I love dearly, and for different reasons. And so with that in mind, I'll think more in terms of the party atmosphere when it comes to what is the right balance of music to put on a season for the Mobile Symphony. Mm-hmm. And I'll think a little bit more in terms of what will have a deep and resonant effect, even if it's not immediately spectacular, let's say, when I'm programming for Muskegon. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that is actually something we talk about in sort of the live performing arts center, programming discussions all the time, is having a deep understanding of your community, they need, what they want. I like how you say the personality. I think it's a great descriptor, because ultimately we are in service of those that are buying tickets and coming and sitting in the seats, right?
We are. I mean, I think of an orchestra as a community service organization. And I was going to say, that another very important part of my job is sort of being a standard bearer for the musicians. That is, to express what it is I'm hoping that they will be able to achieve in their performance of this music. And in that, I'm very, very much affected by what I experienced in Germany when I was in Berlin, literally working with the Berlin Philharmonic, not as a conductor, but as one of many choral singers, standing behind the horns. That's just so cool. But what I noticed from the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, and this is something that they seem to have almost above anyone else, is their ability to, each one of them, so absorb the flow of the music that it shows extremely clearly in their bodies. When they breathe, they move. The whole orchestra sometimes levitates as one before they play. And I often say that it's as if the nervous systems of these musicians across the stage are connected by wires or something, maybe Wi-Fi now, so that each one of them knows exactly what the other one is thinking. But they also show that manifested extremely physically. And not only does that make their music making better, but it also creates a much more powerful effect for the audience, because that way the audience's input is not just oral, it's also visual. And there's so much to look at, and you can let your eye wander generally the way that the music wanders, because the people who are playing the preeminent phrase of music at any given moment, that they're probably going to be the ones moving the most. And then you'll see that movement shift and flow like a wave from one side to the other. And I just love that. And the breathing part, especially breathing before you play, as if you're going to sing, even if it's an instrument that doesn't need to breathe, like to play the violin or drum. You don't need to inhale, but if you do, it makes it so much better.
It's that energy flow that comes from you, from the air to you into your instrument.
Well, in fact, yes. And I will also say I take the word conductor literally, just as a conductor of electricity is able to bring this energy from one thing to another. I think of it as my goal and my duty to transmit the energy from the composer's thought to the page, to the instruments, to the audience, to the wider world, to the universe,
What I'm really hearing, you mentioned you're the conductor of energy, right? And I think people that maybe don't attend a lot of orchestral concerts or engage with classical music would probably assume that you as the conductor are very separate from the musicians, and you are the one that's in charge and you're telling them what to do. But that's not what I'm hearing you say. It feels to me like you consider yourself part of the ensemble, maybe in a slightly different way, but that you are part of them and they are part of you, and you have to work in lockstep together in order to accomplish this transcendent moment that you spoke about.
Right. And, a lot of people think of a conductor as not only a part, but maybe even above, the rank and file of the orchestra. I think of it quite the opposite. I think the person at the very top is the composer who created this amazing sound world, this new piece of music, right? And then the people who are able to create those sounds, those are the musicians, they come right below the composer. They're the ones who are able to embody what it is that the composer envisioned. I'm just the coach. I'm below them. So I'm not the star. I'm the one who helps them to be at their best in realizing this ideal sound world for the composer.
I love that. So when you are with you're working with the ensemble, so you do basically a week of rehearsal leading up to a concert.
Right.
And that when you're in residency or you're sitting down in a venue, you sort of have that time. But when you do a tour with an ensemble, what does that look like? I would love to just know a little bit about the logistics and what that experience is like of going overseas, perhaps with a 40 or 50 person ensemble. What does that feel like from a conductor perspective, from a travel perspective? What is the camaraderie perhaps that comes out of that? What is that touring experience like?
Chicago Philharmonic performed a concert that was wildly successful at the Harris Theater in Chicago and decided to take it to Carnegie Hall. So 1 year ago, Chicago Philharmonic made the trip to Carnegie Hall to perform this concert. And of course, there was a sense of pride, right? The orchestra saying, we get to do this at Carnegie Hall. And to a certain extent, we've arrived, right? There were plenty of musicians who might or might not have been busy with other performances, but made themselves available so they could come on this trip. It was considered something very, very special. And then, of course, everyone's in the same hotel, and there's lots of downtime, or at least a certain amount of downtime in which they can go sightseeing, which, of course, they should. And they did it in groups. Groups of people who probably are friends anyway in Chicago, but I'm sure also plenty of people tagging along who didn't know them that well. I always find that tours are a way to cement friendships and also to build new friendships, because it's such an intense emotional experience all together with everyone all together. And so that's exactly what happened. When you play music, it's emotional by definition, and so you could just be playing nothing but a concert, even without any attendant touring experiences or anything. Just the concert itself is going to have an emotional effect that brings people together.
So I referenced earlier the fact that I've been watching you conduct my hometown symphony orchestra for, it sounds like about a little over 20 years. I can't remember a time when you weren't the conductor of the West Michigan Symphony, but I remember a moment where you turned around to the audience before the concert started, before the first piece started, welcomed everybody from the conductor's podium, and talked specifically about the piece we were about to hear, and about the different emotions, and you're going to hear rain, or you're going to hear this, you're going to hear that, throughout the different movements of the piece. And as, I don't know, maybe 15 or 16-year-old, that was huge. That was a revelatory moment for me, because I don't know that I'd ever seen an artist of that stature or of that position talk directly to an audience in that way. And that is something that you have done for as long as I can remember. And for me, it was
even huge. Last week.
Just last week, you guys just did the People's Choice concert, right?
Right. We did a concert in which, just to explain to the audience what this was, we basically gave the audience a bunch of choices. We're going to play one of these 3 overtures, one of these 4 piano concertos with Charlie Albright, the pianist, and one of these 3 symphonies. And you get to vote for each one. So we've already done sort of a pre-selection. We're sure that anything that the audience picks, we'd love to play. And then they picked really in a very definitive way. It was clear they wanted the William Tell Overture of Rossini. They wanted Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini for the piano piece, and Dvorak's New World Symphony. And that's beautiful. What we played. Now, I wouldn't necessarily have put those 3 pieces together if I were just dreaming up a program on my own, but it worked out really well. Plus, of course, that was the theme. It was audience choice. But to answer your what you're saying about seeing me turn around and talk from the early years, I have always felt that I can do something to counteract the years of bad press that the orchestra world has been getting. And I have to say, by the way, this is 100% the fault of the orchestra world itself. Because for some reason, someone had the idea in the late 19th and early to mid 20th centuries that it was a good idea to make it look like orchestra music was unattainable and that you had to have a certain level of education, especially a certain level of music education, or maybe a certain level of wealth and be part of a certain society, or God forbid, be of a certain race in order to fully appreciate what we had to offer. And I think that that turned so many people off. It turned off more people than anyone outside the orchestra world possibly could have done for them. And you know, the whole idea that, you know, I'm sure you know this, that you have to dress up to go to the symphony. Why? Why do you have to dress up to go? Why? What does that have to do with anything? Nothing.
I don't know.
You bring open ears and an open heart. Or that you can't clap between different sections of a symphony. Even if it's really, really exciting and you want to jump up and down, you have to be absolutely silent and all you hear is a couple of coughs. It's absolutely, to me, that is pathetic. Now, yes, indeed, there are some pieces of music that consist of 4 parts or movements, and it's meant to be experienced as one entity, and I know that. And there are audiences that like to do that, and that's fine, and nothing against that. But if someone gets very excited about the end of the first movement of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto or Piano Concerto, both of which are more exciting than the end of the whole piece, then that's fine. Let them get excited and let them express their applause, and then I'll turn around and acknowledge it, and not painfully either. I'll acknowledge it with a smile and then continue with the next thing. And I didn't realize how revolutionary an idea this is, supposedly. But it's,
I mean, to be honest, I really think it is. And the reason I brought it up is because I remember enjoying that so much and it being such a point of education for me. I was a theater and a dance kid, not a classical music kid. But we would go to these performances, but I would learn so much from just the small explanations you would give about the piece we were going to hear, or the composer, what time and place it was composed in, right? The historical context. And I just think it set me up as an arts administrator to think differently about how we prepare audiences and how we welcome them into our spaces, how we make them feel like they are a part of the experience, that we are not performing at them, we are performing with them.
That's right. That's exactly it.
It just, and I think it just flows so beautifully into what you just talked about with the People's Choice Concert. And West Michigan Symphony has this mission of being the friendliest orchestra in America. So how do you go about from this thing that you do, you know, on stage into all other aspects of sort of your artistic life, of breaking down those barriers, breaking down those preconceived notions, making the orchestra a friendly place for people? Right.
Well, I would say that, you know, if this means that there are certain orchestras that I will never conduct because they insist on silence between movements or they insist on everyone wearing a tuxedo to show up in the audience, then so be it. So be it. My mission is to spread the good word about classical music, and you can't do that by excluding people. You cannot. And it has to be an inclusive art form. And I also feel, and this is part of the talking before and giving context, is that there's no reason why a piece of music has to be a mystery to the audience. My goal is that by the time they hear it, they will understand it. It makes a big difference. In fact, I hope that I conduct well, but all the comments I get from the audience are, "Thank you for talking." Isn't that interesting?
People like to know something about what they're about to experience. I think the context is incredibly helpful. And yes, there were show notes, there were program notes in the program booklet, but that can also be intimidating to somebody who's coming into that very grand space. The Frauenthal is this very glamorous, gold encrusted sort of space. It can be very intimidating to read a page and a half of historical context about this piece they're about to see.
That's right. And I'm glad we have the program notes, but I also am at peace with the fact that probably nobody reads them.
I think there's still some people that read them. I think they're still worthwhile. And some people take them home and read them afterwards, right? People experience it in different ways.
And I do that. Frankly, I do that too. You know, like if I go to a concert and I was really fascinated by a piece, then I'll want to learn everything I can about it. But beforehand, maybe I just want to let it wash over me and experience it. Yes, indeed, with some musical knowledge and understanding, but still in a way that I'm encountering it for the first time. And that's fine. I mean, what you talk about intimidating, I think it's fascinating to think that there are still people who live in Muskegon, maybe within blocks of the Frauenthal, and have never been inside this gorgeous concert hall. I would feel worse about it than I do if I hadn't experienced this in big cities too. I remember once going to a concert of the National Symphony, wonderful orchestra in Washington, D.C., but probably more to the point, they're a full-time year-round orchestra that plays professionally in the Kennedy Center. And I was milling around with some musicians right after the concert outside in the Hall of Nations, I think it was, at the Kennedy Center. And I saw one of the patrons came up to one of the musicians and say, "Now, are you guys paid?" So they didn't realize that it's a full-time professional job for these people, and that they have to spend their entire lives being worthy of it, and their entire childhoods. They lose their childhoods to studying violin. These people who play violin, let's say as an example, have put much more years of study into their profession than any doctor or lawyer, because they start at the age of 3 or 5, you know? Mm-hmm. And it's an extremely serious pursuit to be able to play at this high level. Mm-hmm. And yet, even in, you know, one of the big cities of our country, there are people who come to the orchestra who don't realize that these people are paid. Amazing.
So on that note about artists dedicating, you know, obviously decades of their life to their craft and being these professional musicians, which a lot of people don't realize. I'm interested in your experience working with soloists or small ensembles as guests with the ensembles that you work with. So what has your experience been like with those individuals, and what advice would you give them if they're an artist that wants to go down that path and be a soloist with?
Well, first, I will say that I think that the life and the prospects for a soloist are a little bit better than for a conductor, because you think about it, let's say a typical orchestra plays 8 concerts in a season. They're going to need probably 8 guest artists, but they might need 0 guest conductors because they have a music director. So for a conductor, it's much less likely that an orchestra is going to be looking for one, right? And unless they're having a music director search or something like that, than it is for a guest artist. However, having said that, depending on the instrument, and it's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, you know, there are a lot more people looking for a violin soloist than there are people looking for a didgeridoo soloist or a bassoon soloist or whatever. However, there are also a lot more people playing violin and trying to be violin soloists. So it's harder to carve out your own niche. Sometimes carving out your own niche means just not getting much work. I have a friend who's an excellent percussionist who is trying to be a solo percussionist with orchestras, and he's absolutely wonderful. But it's only so often that an orchestra will even have a percussion soloist or play a percussion concerto, right? I think that if someone wanted to carve out their own path as a soloist, I think the most important thing these days is to have your own, what's the word? I'm going to say a bunch of words that are not the right word. Have your own brand, have your own gimmick, have your own thing that sets you apart. There is a violinist who's excellent. His name is Ray Chen. You might have heard of him. Ray Chen is a very good Australian-American, I believe, violinist. But there are many, many, many violinists who play as well as he does. But what he has is an incredible social media presence. So much so that when he played with the Chicago Symphony, if I'm not mistaken, it was sold out. It was sold out by people who knew him from his online presence, you know, and they wanted to go see him because they enjoyed his personality. And yes, of course, his music making is, as I said, excellent, but there's 100 others who play just as well. So if you have your own thing, and I would say these days, if you have your own thing, online is the way to go.
Well, thank you for that very wise and practical advice and experience. I think that is that resonates and feels very true from the performing arts venue side of things too, that we're always looking at that because that's the way of the world now.
This is sad because my dad told me this as a kid. He said, sometimes it's not what you know, it's who you know. I'll tell you, I had worked really hard and become the best conductor I possibly could, and had the chance with the Mobile Symphony to work with Yo-Yo Ma, and that led to something else with him and something else, and now I've worked with Yo-Yo Ma probably 5, 6, 7 times on different occasions as a conductor with him as a cellist. And one time, like maybe the 5th time, he said to me, "Scott, have you ever conducted the Chicago Symphony?" And I said, "No, I sure would love to." Well, like a week later, the Chicago Symphony called me. I'm not kidding. They called me to conduct them. So, it so much has to do with who you know. And I'm notoriously bad at that because I always feel, I don't want to bother the person.
Sure.
And
of course.
And also, if I'm good enough, I'll be discovered on my own merits. I don't need some famous person singing my praises, but it just makes all the difference in the world. And that's why, like, if I have the opportunity to help somebody and I believe in their work, I will sing their praises to the skies. If that will help them, it's sort of paying it forward in that way.
I love that story. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's a perfect example of luck being preparation meets opportunity, right? And being good at your craft, and when you are good at your craft and you are a good person to work with, opportunity flows your way.
Right. And I will say that preparation meets opportunity works both ways. I mean, I had an experience with another orchestra that will remain nameless, but it's one of the big orchestras of America, where I was recommended by someone whose opinion they believed, and I was hired, and I wasn't ready for it, and I didn't do a great job, and then they didn't hire me again. That kind of thing also happens.
So our audience, a lot of our listeners work for performing arts centers, right? So we are across the country, big cities, small towns, everywhere in between. And I think there is some reticence in our field right now about bringing classical music ensembles into our standard seasons, whether that's a 5-show season or 20 or a 40-show season. So what would you say to arts administrators, programmers like myself that want to program classical music in some way, shape, or form, but are scared that there's no longer an audience for it?
Right. Well, I would say that programming is everything in this situation. In other words, not so much the group, but what is the group playing? What are they going to be doing? So a perfect example would be the West Michigan Symphony in this season. We're doing a superheroes concert. So it involves, and this is a Masterworks concert. This is music, written, the scores to Superman and Spider-Man and Wonder Woman, but also the Stravinsky Firebird Suite, because there's a superhero in that story, and Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet. These are amazing pieces of music. So it's sort of, the concert it's not exactly a mashup, but we are juxtaposing superhero scores with really, some of the greatest symphonic music of the 20th century. So that's one way to do it. I've also seen, let's say, a string quartet coming in with a whole concert of the music of Radiohead, or music from The Lord of the Rings, played by a string quartet. It was originally written for these huge forces, enormous orchestra, chorus, soloists. Now it's just 4 people, but The Lord of the Rings draws people. One of the things that the Chicago Philharmonic is famous for is mashup concerts. Very often they play backup to rock singers, and so the combination of the familiar singer and the full symphony orchestra is extremely attractive to people. In fact, this is interesting. They won't go to a symphony orchestra, but they're extra excited of going to see their artist that they love if that artist is backed up by a symphony orchestra. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's like they're saying, we're so proud of our guy. Our guy gets to work with a full symphony orchestra now. The cellist and singer Leve, who's made a huge impression on the world most recently, performed with the Chicago Philharmonic at Lollapalooza. Our orchestra was the very first one ever to play at any Lollapalooza concert, backing up the singer. And very recently, in fact, just a couple of days ago, Chicago Philharmonic performed a concert called Beethoven and Beyonce. And basically, it's a concert that involved 3 singers who were singing Beyonce, but it was back and forth between that music and Beethoven's 7th in a seamless mashup with the orchestra. I'm not saying it always has to be that, but what I'm saying is that you can program a string quartet, you can program a symphony orchestra, but the programming, what it is that they play, is all important.
I think you've nailed it right on the head. Programming is key. Understanding your community and what they're going to respond to is also key. So. All right. So, Scott, you probably don't know this about the podcast, but we have a time machine, and Brian, one of our other co-hosts, somehow got his hands on a time machine. And what we like to do is take our guests back in time to an earlier moment in their career, and we're going to revisit that. So I'd love to take you back to when you first got hired at the West Michigan Symphony, when I first would have started seeing you conduct. And my question for you is, what do you know now that you wish you had known then?
I think that I have learned, so much more about what the community needs and wants than I knew back then. Back then I was programming generically, right? It's like, this is something that worked over here. This is something that worked over there. But I didn't know, for example, that living in a place where it's cloudy for much of the year, and when the sun does finally come out, it's the most glorious thing in the world, would make our orchestra love the symphonies of Sibelius, because that's what all of that is about. John Sibelius lived in Finland, where the weather is pretty much exactly the same, and it's very, very cloudy in his music up until the end, when there's this moment where the sun bursts through the clouds in a way that is transcendent and transformative and makes you cry as well as laugh just from pleasure. The whole idea of delayed gratification is much more of a thing in West Michigan than it is down in the South, for example, when I'm conducting there. That's one of the ways that the communities are different. Delayed gratification doesn't work as well in the South as it does in West Michigan. Along those lines, my goal for creating a concert has completely changed in that time. At the same time that the orchestra has gotten better and better and better and better and better, my insistence on excellence has become less and less and less and less important. And to one extent, that's kind of would happen naturally, because the excellence is, to a large extent, happening by itself. But what I mean is this. At first, I thought my goal was to create a performance that was as close to perfection as possible, and to present to the audience on a silver platter my ideal vision of how this music should go, as you would hear if I had a chance to make a recording of it, for example. Now, all these years later, I feel that my goal as a musician is to create the most compelling possible experience for the audience, whatever that may be. If our soloist violinist breaks a string, but it's still fascinating, It's not perfect, but it's better than perfect, because it's really interesting, And the audience is really involved in the drama of that. I consider that now to be much more important than what it was. So whereas before we used to say, at least internally, our goal was to be one of the finest regional orchestras in the nation, now that we've reached that status, our goal is to be the friendliest orchestra in America, right? So to create an amazing experience from the moment our listeners leave the house to when they get back home again, I want them to just have the most amazing experience. And that's something you couldn't have taught me back then. I had to learn it on my own over many, many years.
Well, Scott, that is all the time we have for today. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for saying yes and joining me here on There's No Business Like. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Katie. You do a great job. Keep it up.
Hey, Katie, I just want to say thank you for bringing Scott to our podcast. And I love that this is a completely different part of our industry that we really haven't delved into yet. It's something that I have a little bit of experience with, nothing close to what Scott's experience is, but I think it's really interesting to hear from his perspective as a maestro, especially in these days after the pandemic, particularly how few opportunities there are for people, how lucky he feels to have engagements that he has. And so, kudos to him for that. And anyone that's been following what's been going on with orchestra in the US in particular, this was not something that happened as a result of the pandemic, but with the shrinking number of opportunities, the closings of many different symphonies and orchestras right in the mid-aughts, as the kids say, leading up to the pandemic, which kind of put more of a crunch on things. And that's when there was like this massive change, and not all of them closed or went away, but the fact that there's organizational changes. It used to be a lot more corporate corporate in structure of a lot of these orchestras, and you'd be engaged as a full-time employee, 52 weeks of the year with guesting opportunities and other things. And then really, again, it happened before the pandemic, but the pandemic was the big push, where now it's a lot of part-time opportunities or engagement by engagement or special opportunities rather than, the current full-time gig that you work at this orchestra and that's your thing. It's a very different model. I know they're still trying to figure things out, but, I think it's an important conversation to have. And I think we should definitely continue more conversations in this whole area.
Yeah, I don't want to out Brian on this one, but I think it's very obvious that he is now trying to moonlight as a music director. So congrats, Brian. Very excited for you. That sounds fun. Katie, I think it was really interesting because I'm always fascinated by music directors who are, working in multiple markets and often very different markets. And so it was nice to hear Scott's perspective on, working in those markets, because from an outsider's perspective, when I heard that people were doing this, I was like, man, what a sweet gig. I just go, hey, this month we're doing this show, and I'm just going to put this same show and same program on in the 3 or 4 markets that I'm working in. When, he gave some really good, interesting things about, why that doesn't work. So I appreciated that part, especially.
Yeah. And I love the word he used, personality of a community. We talked about, we talk about understanding your community a lot, but I love that word personality and really thinking about a community as having sort of unique characteristics like that. And I think he offers that unique perspective from working in Chicago and Mobile and in Michigan. So I really enjoyed thinking about, and I was trying to put my finger on what is the personality of Midland, right where I'm at. And I'm still trying to figure it out within that context. I can talk about what I think they like or what I think they want or what they need, but what's the personality of this community? I thought that was a really interesting way to put it.
Yeah. And, thinking back to what Brian just said about, the remaining orchestras in this country finding a new way forward, listening to Scott talk about just how he runs the performance of the orchestra and turning around and talking to the audience and why do they need to be dressed up? And all of these things that have built this wall around classical music for a very long time. I'm sure there still are a lot of places that don't want to change when people clap between movements. But for the vast majority of them, even incorporating some of that into it and breaking down those walls, it's got to factor into your longevity somewhere.
I agree. Modern ways for modern audiences. I will also say, though, it's not like everything that's old is bad. I remember when I performed with an orchestra when I was in college, I was in the chorus. We did Mendelssohn's Elijah. And I remember standing up there and just at the time, the audience was all in the bow ties and tuxedos or whatever they were wearing, very formal wear. And it elevated the whole thing to this magical, extra special event. But again, that was a different time. And maybe there's still places where that's appropriate and having those special moments or times, but definitely on the average, people are less formal than they used to be in every way. I mean, you look at work environments, men used to always have to wear suits. Then it was just ties and they didn't have to wear the jacket. Now, Kevin's still wearing a collared shirt, but he's not wearing a tie. I rarely ever even wear a collared shirt. And most days I wear jeans now, even for formal meetings. So, it's just the trends that are happening as we're just becoming more allowing to be more comfortable in what we normally wear in our everyday life to conduct business. But
I mean, we have been asking you to put pants on, though.
It's for a while now. I keep saying, Zoom, how do you even know? If I didn't tell you, how would you know?
I mean, it's the constant need for you to stand up and show. That's
Oh yeah, I do stand up once in a while to get a snack. But, yeah.
But Brian, I do think that's a good point. We are less formal, right? And audiences are looking for different things. But to Scott's point about being the friendliest orchestra and it doesn't matter and all of these barriers we've put up, then how you might say, yes, we don't care what people wear, right? You can be informal, you can be dressed up, doesn't matter. But how are you then messaging that as an organization? What are the photos that you're using in your marketing materials? What are the people in those photos wearing? How are you talking about the experience? How are you framing that to potential audience members? If we don't tell people that we are breaking the norm or we're changing those expectations, like actively express that, then people will continue to assume that, I think particularly in classical music, that is still the expectation, right? So I think there's some legwork that needs to be done for us as administration professionals to actually message the changing expectations. You can put it on your website, you can, put a new dress code policy, but like, are people going to find it buried on your website? Probably not, right? They have this image in their head of what it means to go to an orchestral concert, and that is deep seated. It comes from media, it comes from people's lived experiences. So then how do we actively message that we are changing that and accepting that?
In the orchestra leagues, things that they put out, looking back at 2025, that the majority of orchestras across the US are having these issues and having these conversations. But there are shining beacons on the hill. Atlanta Symphony Orchestra is one of them, which has been now several years. This has been the one of the shining cases where, it was when all the orchestras were having financial catastrophes and some of them collapsing. And a lot of them were turning towards doing like the most popular classics and stuff. And they said, you know what, we're going to do new music by underrepresented composers like women and people of color, and doing all these things. And they took this really extreme chance. It doesn't seem that extreme today maybe, but at the time for orchestra, it was a really big chance, and they were hugely successful as a result. Now they still do the big, classical composers, and they have successes with those too, but they're finding that their audiences are really looking for the new and the underserved people that haven't had a chance to have their music performed by orchestra and so forth. And they're working with schools and other things to kind of introduce that idea, and changing dress codes and all of the ways to make people feel more comfortable and welcome and inclusive, and all of the things that we know are recipes towards success no matter what you're looking at. So
yeah, and I have to say, I've been to the orchestra as a child and as an adult, and it's never been my jam. I'm kind of one of those people that has an impression of what it is, and went and was uncomfortable because I was dressed up, and there were a lot of rules that I didn't know, and so I was trying to figure out how to follow them as I went on. So I think I'm in the example of people that are just a little bit meh about the orchestra. But listening to Scott, I've never heard anyone talk about the energy and conducting the energy from the composer's thoughts through the breath that the musicians are breathing, through the instruments and into the audience like that. And that is a fascinating idea to me. And I do think part of the orchestra experience that's tough for me is that it's not super visual. And like, there's something about that idea of watching that energy flow that like really kind of excited me about maybe like trying it again and seeing if I can see
do
that.
it, Danielle, do it.
But it also like so this was like two parts of the conversation, but like, so thinking about how that's really important to him, and then thinking about the concept of like, yeah, let people clap between the movements, like when they're feeling it, like, because they've got this energy now, right, that they need to let out. And it just like this sort of like concept of conducting the energy, like that makes total sense to me. And I'm just going to clap whenever I want to clap now. And I'm excited about it.
I love that. And Danielle, you're talking about it not being a super visual medium. When I go to an orchestral concert, I actually sit as far back in the hall as I can because I want to be able to watch the musicians. Like,
yeah, I want to see the cymbals.
Yeah.
Because they're always in the back.
Watching the timpani rolls, watching the different sections sort of come to life, right, as they're coming in and out of the piece. Like, I find that to be really enjoyable. And I get into sort of like this almost meditative mode when I go to a classical concert, and I find myself thinking like really deep thoughts and thinking about, just sort of my mind wanders as I'm watching and I'm enjoying. And I think that's not necessarily what you're quote unquote supposed to do. You're supposed to be, rapt attention, but I find it to be a really enjoyable experience. But I have, as a patron, molded that experience to a thing that works for me, right? Sitting towards the back, making sure I can see. And so I would just encourage people to do that for themselves, and for venues to think about how do we encourage people to make it an experience that works for them versus these very, strict rules and expectations that we have. So, Yeah, I don't know. In talking with Scott and then reflecting on it, I was like, yeah, I need to make sure that I take Leo to an orchestral concert this winter or this spring, right? We haven't done that in a while, and it's a great opportunity to just have a different experience and introduce your kids to something different. And more orchestras are doing more family friendly work as well, which is really exciting to see. That's a change that's coming. So yeah, stay tuned.
In listening to you and Danielle describe your experience with that, it just brings me back to your conversation with Scott and how infectious his passion is for this. And, you know, I'm already a classical music lover. I love orchestral music and seeing orchestras and stuff, but it just made me want to go see him behind the baton or holding the baton or however you say it, because, you know, I could tell that he's just so passionate about it, and that just is going to elevate, you know, it's going to be infectious with all the musicians he works with and so forth, and just bring extra energy to the room. And so I just, you know, kudos to him for finding and being able to do what he loves to do. And I'm glad he's out there also sharing his story with us and hopefully others to kind of help the rest of the world get back onto, yeah, orchestra's not dead. There's a place for it, and we just need to find a way to navigate these times to fit these times, and to not just stay stagnant with the way it's always been and let it die, but there's ways to adapt and make it still relevant. And so I'm really glad that again you had this conversation.
I agree, Brian. I might be a little bit biased, but I also greatly enjoy watching Scott conduct and have had the pleasure and privilege, obviously, of doing that for many, many years. So thank you to Scott for joining us today on There's No Business Like. It was such a pleasure to have you. Thank you, friends, for joining me for this conversation. And we hope you'll join us next time here on the pod. Bye, everyone.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to There's No Business Like. Our producers and hosts are Brian Zelmer, Josh Benson, Kevin Maynard, Katie Miller, and me, Danielle Van Hook. Views expressed in this podcast are ours alone and are not reflective of the organizations we are a part of. Keep up with us at nobusinesslike.com. There you'll find links to all of our episodes and socials. If you like this podcast, give us a like, a follow, a review, or our favorite, a 5-star rating. Oh, wait, what was that site? I got it, don't worry. It is nobusinesslike.com. Do I sound out bus-I-ness every time I type it? Yep, sure do. Stay in touch, my friends. Is Kevin ready?
No, Kevin's not ready. Okay.
No, he turned his monitor. He went into go mode. It was weird. He was like, "Oh, you guys can't see this," and then like,
but you can see it on his face.
Yeah,
he's got focus face.
I zoomed in on his eye and I could see the reflection on his retina. So I'm holding a mirror up so I can actually read the words because they're backwards.
And he's looking at a sign that says "Help me."
Get me out of this podcast.
My problem is I know it's Morse code that with his blinks, but I never learned Morse code. So I can't interpret what he's saying.
Brian, you could have really helped me there, but
Also problem, it's Kevin code, not Morris.
also don't think that's how Morse is pronounced.
It's not. It's not. Between the what's it called? Between the movements. Thank you.
Listeners, Danielle just did a little shimmy when she said movements.
And then made myself laugh, and now I lost all train of thought. What festival do they do that in? What festival is there?
Well, Montague has a really, really steep hill, and they do a pumpkin roll down the hill, like a pumpkin rolling contest.
There's their weird Michigan thing.
There it is. Michigan thing. Yep.
I've been to the pumpkin roll,
of course,
in Montague.
I've eaten the pumpkin roll before.
I was going to say where I'm from, we eat pumpkin rolls.
Yeah.
Have I rolled a pumpkin down that hill?
Yes.
Maybe.
During the off season, probably.